Hello everyone, Shayla here from Stuart Moore's Textiles. It is January, which means it is time to take down all of those holiday decorations. If you're anything like me, you will have a lot of pomegranates left over. I like to decorate the house with bowls of these bright red fruit as natural Christmas decor. Each January, as I take decorations down, I like to make a big pot of pomegranate dye from the rind of my pomegranate fruits and freeze the seeds to have all year. Pomegranate skins will give these gorgeous soft yellows that I love so much. Today I'm going to show you how I use these pomegranate skins to dye linen fabric and 100% wool yarn. I'm going to put on my apron for this project, and I suggest that you do too, because pomegranate seeds are famous for staining your clothes. I'm going to use a knife that looks a little bit bigger than what you might expect. Because my pomegranates are a little bit on the older side, it's going to take a really sharp knife with a little bit of heft to get through this skin very easily. I'm going to look for the spines first. They kind of stick out because this fruit is a bit older. To start, I'm going to cut off the very top of my pomegranate and save that. As you can see where the membrane connects with the spine. And that's where I want to start scoring my pomegranates all the way around, along the ridges, which is also known as the spine. I'll start from the top, and I'll just put a deep score all the way down until about an inch, I'd say, from the center bottom of my fruit. And I'm going to do this all the way around. Each time I find a spine, I'm just going to cut along that spine from the top almost all the way down to the bottom, but not quite. And I don't need to cut very deep, just enough to get through the skin and maybe about a half an inch of the membrane. And I'll do this all the way around my fruit, feeling my way around to find the spines and cutting along the spines of the fruit. Honestly, if you don't get this just right for this part, it's really no big deal because you're going to end up scraping away all the seeds in the membrane from the skin, which can be done many ways. This is just one way to do it so that you can remove big sections of seeds in membrane in one fell swoop. As you can see, this is a big section of seeds that I've scored along the membrane, and it looks like I've cut pretty perfectly. We'll use two bowls for this next step, and I just want to separate the seeds in the membrane in the big clear bowl, and then I'm going to reserve in my white bowl just the skin or rind. I think I'll use rind and skin interchangeably throughout this tutorial, and I don't notice that I'm doing it, but it's the same thing that I'm talking about. It's just the red part, the outer skin of the pomegranate. While I separate all the parts of this pomegranate, I want to tell you a little bit about what makes the skin of a pomegranate so great for dyeing. The rind has been used as a natural dye for centuries, which is initially what drew me to pomegranates as a natural dye. If something has been used as a natural dye for hundreds of years, you can pretty well bet it's probably a good dye to use. Pomegranate skins are rich in tannins and very wash-fast and light-fast when properly mordanted. Because they are so high in tannin, you can also use pomegranate skins in your mordating process and as a dye. Today I'm going to show you a direct dye method for natural dyeing with these rinds without pre-mordanting. I won't be mordanting this yarn or fabric before I dye them because you really want to have a separate dye facility if you're going to be using heavy metal salts. And I don't recommend using them in a home kitchen, particularly when you are boiling them and creating breathable steam. Your dyes without this step will still last a very long time. Each dye I select for tutorials in the Start Natural Dyeing video series are all selected because they work well without using heavy metal salts and are for the most part safe for making at home in a well-ventilated area. I say for the most part only because you are still using heat. So always be careful and wear mitts and gloves, and don't burn yourself from steam when you check your dye pots. But other than that, we are just dyeing with fruit, and so it's pretty safe. If you have questions about the mordanting process, or you'd like me to go into more depth about what a professional mordanting process looks like, I'm happy to do that. If there's an interest, just let me know in the comments below, or reach out with an email, or send a smoke signal, any way you'd like to get in contact and let me know. I make these videos because it's my passion and what's on my mind at any given moment. So if there's ever anything you guys want to see from me, just let me know, and I am happy to receive that feedback and create videos based on things that you guys are interested in. Alright, so back to the topic at hand. As you can see, I'm really doing a lot of just tiny little stuff now at this point, and I really just want to separate the pomegranate skin from the rest of the fruit. I'm keeping all of the membrane and the seeds, the delicious part, in one bowl. Later on, I'll go ahead and separate the membrane and the seeds before I freeze them, but I'm not really worried about that right now because I just want to get all of the skins separated, and I want to make sure that as much of the membrane is removed from that. So if it seems like I'm really taking a lot of time, snack, don't forget to snack. Sorry. I'm so hungry I had to take a bite. Some professional tutoring going on here. Anyways, just make sure that you have just your rinds left, because that is where all of your dye is going to come from. You can kind of see on the inside that yellow color, that rich yellow color. Next, I'm going to do the same thing I did to my orange slices in my last video. I'll put them on a baking tray with parchment paper and put them in the oven on 185 degrees, turning them every half hour, and removing them when they are hard and dry. You can judge for yourself if they feel hard and dry to you. It's not really the end of the world if they don't get all the way dry, but it does make the dyeing a lot easier, and you can also save them for the rest of the year and have a whole year of pomegranate skin dye whenever you want. So to prep my yarn, I am going to start by winding it into skeins. I'm just doing one today, so just this one skein. I use the legs of an upside down chair to wind this skein around, and a skein just means a bundle of yarn. But I want it to be in this big long loop like this, and then I'll tie them sort of at 4 different points around, and it'll look a little bit like this. And the only reason I do that is just to keep everything from getting tangled during the dye process, but also not making it tight so that it leaves white spots on my yarn, because when this yarn fills up with water, it's going to get a lot bigger. So you don't want to basically create a resist using these little ties. You just want to keep it in place in this big circle so that it doesn't get tangled during your dye process, because you will be moving the yarn around a little bit. So I'm just going to do that 4 times all the way around my yarn, or equally dispersed throughout my yarn. For the linen, I'm just using scraps from what's left over from the SMT Dye Studio. So this is just straight up linen. Nothing has been done to it except that I've washed it first. Next, I'll fill a bowl full of warm water, and I will let the wool and the linen soak for about 2 hours. When you're adding the yarn, you just want to make sure that you're pushing it underneath the water. This is warm water, and because wool felts in warm water, you just want to be careful not to jostle the wool too much, because then it'll felt. So I'm just using my fingertips just to press it down, because it will float on water if it's dry and it doesn't get pressed down. The linen as well takes a while to absorb the water, so I'm just going to press it to make sure it's all underneath that water, and then I'm going to leave it to soak for at least 2 hours. Always. Very important. So keep an eye on the time. Here are my hard pomegranate rinds, and I don't usually knock them against things to make sure they're hard, I'm doing this just to be dramatic to tell you that they are all the way dried now. To create my dye pot, I'm going to add my pomegranate chips to a pot, or in this case a crock pot, and cover them with water. I'll put them on the stove or crock and slowly raise the temperature over an hour and let them simmer for another hour or so after that, always keeping my pot under a boil. I'll note the time just so I can keep track of how long it's been cooking. I like to use a crock pot because you can keep the temperature fairly even and low over a long period of time, and you don't have to watch your pot constantly to make sure that it's not getting too hot or boiling over. I'll just take a look at these. These have been on for a few hours, and I'll notice that this pomegranate to me looks like it still has dye left in it. Generally, they turn quite gray after all the dye has been removed from them from this process. So I'll probably put these on for another half hour to an hour and just keep tracking them until they do turn gray. Once I am satisfied that all of the dye has been extracted, I'm going to strain my dye liquid from my pomegranate skins. I'll let this dye liquid cool before moving on to the next step, but when it does, I'll pour the dye liquid back into the crock, but in this case, because I'm dyeing yarn and fabric, and since I want to do that separately, I will pour half in the crock and half into a separate pot for my fabric. I'm going to remove my fabric from its soak and squeeze out all of the extra water. And then I'll open it all the way back up and slowly and gently dip it into my dye bath. Once it's mostly in the dye bath, I want all of the fabric to be submerged under the water. I'm going to push out all of the air pockets and make sure that all of my fabric is completely submerged in my dye bath. I don't want any air pockets because they will give me splotches and uneven dye on my final product. I will do the same thing for my yarn, removing it from the water and squeezing out all of the excess water before I slowly put it in my dye bath. And again, I'm going to make sure it's completely submerged and even push out all of any air pockets that might be underneath. I am going to put my pot of fabric and my crock of yarn back on the stove and in the crock pot and slowly raise the temperature over an hour to just below a boil, and then let them simmer for about another hour each, checking on them regularly. I will take it off the heat after this time and let the fabric and yarn cool slowly and completely in the dye liquid. This is a really important step. It's exciting to see what you have made, but to get the most long-lasting results, don't remove your fabric or wool before the dye bath has been left to cool completely on its own. I highly recommend also just leaving the dye bath overnight. I'm pretty happy with the warm tones I see on this linen, so I'm going to remove it from the dye bath, squeezing any leftover dye back into the pot before I rinse my fabric. I'll start rinsing my fabric with cool water to remove any of the excess dye still left over. Slowly, I will change the water, each time filling my rinse bucket with warmer and warmer water and removing the water when it turns yellow. I will add a bit of gentle soap at this point and continue rinsing in warm water until the water remains clear as I rinse. I'm going to use my trusty cheese knife at this point. Normally I would wear gloves when the water gets quite warm, but because they are all the way in the dye studio and I don't have them, my cheese knife is a great substitute because this water has become too hot for my hands. And here you can see that it's very warm water, but it's now clear And so I know that my rinsing is finished. I'm going to squeeze out the excess water, and then I'm going to let this fabric dry out of direct sunlight in the air. I'm just going to air dry it. I think that this fabric looks so gorgeous, and I'm so excited to see what it looks like when it's dry. Next, I'm going to rinse my wool yarn. I have let it cool completely, leaving it overnight before removing it from the dye pot. Again, I will squeeze any leftover dye back into the dye pot and preserve this so that I can use it for a second batch. Because wool is very easy to felt when it is jostled in warm water, I am only going to use cool water and some gentle soap to rinse my wool, being careful to not felt it with too much movement. Just as I did with the fabric, I'm going to move my wool and remove the water when it turns really yellow, each time replacing it with fresh water. In the case of the wool, however, I'm not going to increase the temperature with each new rinse bath. I'm going to keep it pretty cool to cold the entire time I rinse until I have rinsed it enough times that the water stays clear when I put it in a new rinse bath. Again, I'm going to take both of these and dry them out of direct sunlight and just in the air. Yay! And this is what they look like when they are dry. I think that they are so gorgeous, and I love pomegranate dyeing. It is so easy, and you get so many great colors with just a few pomegranates. I only used 3 for this whole process, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Here is some of that wool that we dyed with the walnuts from the last video. I hope you guys like these videos and like natural dyeing and want to give it a try yourself because it's such a rewarding hobby. I even turned it into a profession. So happy dyeing, thank you for watching, and see you in my next one.